Hello, welcome to Prairie Conservation Action Plan's Prairie's Got the Goods Week. My name is Caitlin Rose and I'm the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Check out other events going on for Prairie's Got the Goods Week. Don't miss Wetlands Got the Goods by Chuck Deschamps with Ducks Unlimited Canada. That will be this afternoon at 3 p.m. Tomorrow, we have a talk at noon by Tara Mullern-Davidson called A Perfect Partnership, Ranching and Native Prairie. Our final presentation for the week will be Biodiversity in Alberta's Grasslands by Dr. Cameron Carlisle with the University of Alberta. Check out the PCAP website for more information about these events and other upcoming webinars. I would like to take a moment to note that in-kind support for this project has been given by the University of Saskatchewan. This project was undertaken with the financial support of the Government of Canada and the Federal Department of Environment and Climate Change Canada. Now a bit about our presenter. Ken Belcher is a professor in the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics and the School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Saskatchewan. His areas of research interest include natural resource and environmental economics, and environmental policy with a particular focus on agricultural landscapes. He has worked on questions concerning values of ecosystem goods and services, the effective targeting of agri-environmental policy, and the governance and management of conservation policies related to wetlands, wildlife, biodiversity, and climate change. Before we begin, I would like to mention that if you have any questions during the presentation, please type it into the questions section on your webinar dashboard. All questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Ken Belcher.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin, for that introduction. Let's make sure my screen's working okay. Thank you for PCAP, for giving me the opportunity to give this talk. The title of my talk, Value and Policy Considerations for Native Prairie Ecosystem Services. I've taken the liberty of making a couple of changes to this. One is the use of the term, rather than ecological goods and services, ecosystem services, which seems to be the more accepted term used in a lot of the literature. And also to just talk about ecosystem services, which I'll talk about a little bit later, in that the goods part of the goods and services seems to be, in a lot of literature, subsumed into the services component.
Okay.
So,
Ken, we can't see your screen at the moment.
Okay.
Did you get the show my screen?
Okay, I did, but I didn't. Let's try this.
There we go.
Okay, you can see it now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's okay, no problem.
Okay, just as a sort of a brief outline of what I'm hoping to cover, I'm going to spend a little bit of time just characterizing what we're talking about when we talk about ecosystem services. I know that a lot of the audience will know this, but I think it's useful to just going to go through the definitions. A little bit of time talking about or looking at the linkages between ecosystem services and policy development, and then some discussion on the specific policy instruments, or some of the specific policy instruments used to address ecosystem services provision in agriculture. So, ecosystem services. The concept of ecosystem services is focused quite directly on interpreting ecosystem conditions and functions in the context of human well-being or human welfare. So the idea of ecosystem services is very much that around how humans benefit from ecosystem functions. So where are the benefits, how do those benefits flow, and what are the value of those benefits is very much what ecosystem services looks at. So I'm going to focus very much on that human welfare or human well-being aspect of ecosystem services. There's a lot of definitions of ecosystem services. I think Gretchen Daly's from 1997, who was one of the first people who did a lot of work on ecosystem services, is a useful one. She defines ecosystem services as the conditions and processes through which natural ecosystems and the species which make them up sustain and fulfill human life. So again, very much that aspect of human well-being, human welfare is the focus of ecosystem services. So this definition then has kind of two primary components. Ecosystem services considers the processes and functions at a wide range of scales, so including large-scale biogeochemical cycles to very small-scale life cycles or organism scale. So there's a wide range of scales that are captured by ecosystem services. And then, as I've sort of mentioned already, the definition is very much a human-centered concept where the benefits from ecosystem functions are viewed as end products used and enjoyed by humans. So the human value is a real important part of that concept of ecosystem services. So I'm using the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment characterization of ecosystem services, which is, I think, by far the most common characterization. And I'm going to break it down here just so we've got the sort of the background framework that we're going to use in the latter part of the talk. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment breaks down ecosystem services into four generally broad areas. The first is what they call provisioning services. And provisioning services are those endpoints or goods that are valued. And these values, in many cases, well, in some cases, can be determined through markets. So these are the aspects of ecosystem services where we see market involvement. So things like food is the output from provisioning services, raw materials such as lumber, fresh water, medicinal resources, etc., are what would be considered provisioning services. Just at this point, I just want to go back a little bit about what I talked about very start is in the terminology of ecosystems, goods and services, the goods is usually referring to the provisioning services as part of the ecosystem services framework. So provisioning services are one of those four broad areas. The second are what's called regulating services, and these are the functions and services that maintain balance of ecosystems to enable human survival. So here's some examples of them. So local climate and air quality regulation would be considered a regulating service. Carbon sequestration in sinks would be a regulating service. Moderation of extreme events, erosion prevention and maintenance of soil fertility, pollination services, biological control, etc. I want to make the point here that there's not a firm line between these various definitions of the components of ecosystem services. There's parts of provisioning services that overlap with regulating services, etc. So they're not clearly defined, but this is a reasonable way to think about them. The third category are what's called cultural services, and these are ecosystems services that support well-being and health, so things like recreational, mental, and physical health, tourism, aesthetic appreciation and inspiration, and spiritual experience and sense of place. So again, these are services that provide well-being to humans, but they provide well-being through a different path than what we've talked about up to this point. Certainly different than the provisioning services. And then finally, what is defined as supporting services, which is the range of natural systems and functions that really enable the provisioning, regulating, and cultural services. So this is kind of the foundation on which the other three are built upon. So things like primary production, maintenance of genetic diversity, nutrient cycling, and soil formation. So from that, I'm sure this is a diagram that anybody who's looked at ecosystem services is familiar with. This is again from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and it shows the sort of the interactions between those various components or various segments of ecosystem services. So we see supporting services are providing for the provisioning, regulating, and cultural services. In some versions of this diagram, we sometimes see an arrow running between regulating and provisioning, and sometimes regulating to cultural as another relationship that's important to recognize. But this provides a reasonable framework for, or a reasonable characterization of how ecosystem services can be interpreted or were interpreted by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. this framework that ecosystem services is built on the processes and functions of ecosystems, or this framework is built on those functions. As I've said earlier, these processes and functions are only relevant when there's an outcome that can be identified as a constituent of human well-being, and this can be a contribution to human well-being either directly or indirectly. But that's an important part of the ecosystem service. So the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment sort of developed that figure a little further to explicitly include the constituents of well-being that flow from those ecosystem services. And so I won't go through all of the various points of this, but we can see that the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment looks at the role of provisioning services, regulating services, and cultural services to different constituents of well-being, including security, basic material for good life, health, good social relations, and freedom of choice and action. So that blue box in that framework is really the important part or an important aspect of the ecosystem service framework, in that it reflects the aspects of ecosystem services that provide that specific component of well-being. Okay? So that's again is from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Thinking about bringing this down a little more specifically to the area that we want to talk about is thinking about ecosystem services that flow from grasslands. And I've just put down some examples here of, these are sort of more local links that are comparable to what that last diagram showed. And so for grassland or rangeland systems, these are the ones that we probably see receiving the most attention in the ecosystem service literature. So things like water purification, which has as a specific well-being component is the provision of quality water. So the quality water aspect of it is the aspect that we can specifically link to human well-being. Carbon storage is another ecosystem service that occurs through grassland ecosystems. The specific benefit or contribution to human well-being is the contribution of carbon storage to the mitigation of climate change effects. Forage production, again, is a grassland ecosystem service. The specific aspect of that contributes to human well-being, or one specific aspect, I wouldn't say that it's the only one, is livestock production. So the production of livestock commodities as a specific contribution to human well-being. Wildlife habitat provides specific contributions to human well-being in the form of recreational opportunities. So this may fall under the category of cultural ecosystem services. So things like hunting, wildlife viewing as being the components that are specifically linked to human well-being. And then finally, pollination services, which contribute to crop production. So in those 5 ecosystem services, I'm trying to identify at least one aspect of them that would be linked directly to human well-being, and that helps us in terms of understanding the role of ecosystem services. Just as a quick sideline here, just for the interest of the audience, the federal government has just come out with a document called the Ecosystem Services Toolkit. I think it came out about 2 weeks ago, maybe 3. But I was notified of the link literally this morning, and so I threw this slide in with a specific link showing this toolkit that's been developed. I haven't had a lot of chance to look at it, but it does provide some very specific steps to doing an ecosystem service assessment, and so provide some worksheets and some various tools that someone, if they wanted to do an ecosystem service assessment, this would be the steps you'd do. So I thought this was relevant to what we're talking about today. So there's the link there if you're interested, and it's an interesting document to look at and relevant to what we're talking about. Okay, so given that background, then what I want to talk a little bit now is about how do we apply, or what ways has this ecosystem service framework been applied for policy work. And it's interesting to note, or useful to note, that much of the work that's been looked at that's been used to operationalize this ecosystem service framework is for policy development in agriculture. And so specifically agricultural development policy, agro-environmental policy are the primary areas, not the only areas, but the primary areas where that ecosystem service framework has been used. And certainly back in 1992, the Earth Summit acknowledged the relationship between agriculture, sorry, that should say ecosystem services, not EG&S, acknowledged that relationship between agriculture and ecosystem services. So agriculture is an interesting industry to look at when we're talking about ecosystem services because it is the area, it is the industry where it's been used the most. So thinking about agricultural systems, we know that agricultural production is dependent on ecosystem services. We've already alluded to that. So things like soil formation, nutrient cycling, pollination, etc., are all critical to agricultural systems, to agricultural production, to agricultural productivity. And these ecosystem services, where they exist, provide direct benefits to farmers and land managers. So that ecosystem service component is critical for the maintenance of agriculture. And in the management of agriculture, it involves quite specifically the redirection of energy and nutrient flows to the production of desired, usually market economies. So given these ecosystem services that ecosystem, the functions that are occurring on the land, the role of an agricultural manager is to try and redirect those nutrient and energy flows to the production of commodities that can be sold on the market. That's the primary objective of an agricultural manager. And so we know that given that sort of characterization, there's a number of ecosystem services that provide benefits that, from the perspective of the farm, have uncertain value or only indirect value. So there's certain aspects of the ecosystem services that we see that the farmer can recognize as having direct benefit to them, but there's certain aspects of the ecosystem services that are not, that it's more difficult to see the direct benefit, or if there is any direct benefit to the farmer. But these ecosystem service benefits may have significant implications for societal well-being more broadly. And so that's sort of getting at where I want to focus this policy question, or where policy comes from. And I think this, in a paper by Rule in 2007, they identified or defined what they called the tragedy of ecosystem services, I think flowing from tragedy of the commons type concepts. And so I'll just read off this definition because I think it's worthwhile to sort of think about. In the absence of regulation or incentives to steer land management decisions towards the production of regulating and or cultural services, land managers naturally direct their resource base towards provisioning services associated with the production of agricultural commodities. So what this tragedy ecosystem services, it sort of summarizes what we've talked about, in that land managers, given the information that they have, will tend to direct their production systems or their land resource base towards the provision of or towards provisioning services rather than cultural or regulating services. So while we know that farmers and land managers will often have very strong environmental stewardship goals, and those stewardship goals will influence their decisions, economic sustainability on the farm will often receive priority. And so the incentives for them is to direct their activities towards provisioning services. So I think this is a useful little table. This is some work that came out of in 2008 from Swinton, and all this table shows is an example of some environmental benefits to Michigan farmers. So it's not specifically relevant to Saskatchewan, but I think it's still useful. And if we look at this table, we can see on the bottom to the benefits to the farm on one side and the benefits to society on the other. And so we can see things like soil organic matter as an environmental benefit have high importance to the farm because they're soil organic matter is directly related to the productivity of the farm and the development of commodities and provisioning services. And so we can carry on. Soil conservation also has a high benefit to the farm. Nitrate leaching, beneficial insects, and less phosphorus runoff all have a component of direct benefit to the farm and a component of provisioning services. The other two environmental benefits that Swinton identified were things like less pesticide risk and less global warming. And these, when evaluated, have probably a higher relative importance to society and a relatively lower relative importance to the farm. So looking at that list, we can see that from a farm or a land manager's perspective, those top 5 environmental benefits will be things that the farmer will tend to manage to increase, and the bottom 2 will be environmental benefits that the manager will not really have an incentive to provide. And so this is sort of supporting that tragedy of ecosystem services concept. So this is another little diagram just to sort of illustrate this further. This is from actually a master's thesis, but I thought it was an interesting little figure from Blewett. And what this shows is that on the x-axis we have level of land use from natural to heavily degraded land use, so light use, extensive, intensive. And then the curves represent the provision of different types of ecosystem services. And in this case, we can see that the maximum level of provisioning services in this analysis, which I think was Scotland agricultural land, is under intensive land use. So with intensive land use, this manager is maximizing the provisioning services. When we look at some of the other the regulating services are maximized with under a natural land base, and cultural recreational services are maximized according to this figure somewhere between natural and light use. And so again, we can see that given the presence of certain types of incentives, the land user or the manager of the land will tend to adopt a land use intensity that provides the greatest level of provisioning services, which may not be the same level that provides these regulating or cultural services. So that's just to illustrate the point a little more. So given this so this is what we've talked about, given the status quo incentives for land management, we get this tragedy of ecosystem services, and in that case, we may find that social well-being, as related to those provision of the full suite of ecosystem services, may not be maximized. And so this is where there's a role for policy. So implementation of different types of policy initiatives to change the incentives and encourage the provision of a larger range of ecosystem services for societal benefit. So so that brings me into the next section of the talk, which is really talking more explicitly about policy instruments and some of the work that's been done related to policy instruments in the last little while on ecosystem services. I've listed some of the various policy instruments. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but these are various types of tools that can be used in a policy context to encourage ecosystem service provision. I'm going to focus primarily on direct payments programs and talk about a couple of the other ones as well. So in one of the pieces of information that we need in developing policy effectively, we need to understand the values of the ecosystem services both to land managers and to society. So an important aspect of this concept of ecosystem services and the development of appropriate policy is having some way to measure values. So what's the social value of ecosystem services? So given a particular ecosystem service and a particular contribution to well-being, what is the true value to society of that? And does society, if society has a high value for it, does that mean that there should be some policy put in place to encourage that? And on the other side, what is the cost of providing those ecosystem services? from the in an agricultural context, we often have privately owned land, and so the provision of ecosystem services may impose, at times, would impose a specific cost on the landowner, so or the farmer. So what is the cost of providing that ecosystem service? And so those two very, very simply defined components of value are really necessary to develop appropriate policy measures and effective policy measures. And what we see because of this importance of value is we tend to see policy developed with a focus on a small subset of ecosystem services. And the subset of ecosystem services that we focus on, that policy is focused on, are those that can be measured and can be interpreted as valuable to society. So those aspects that are more easy to define their value are the ones that we see policy focused on. For example, cultural values, some of the cultural values are much more difficult to come up with some societal values for, and so cultural values tend not to be focused on very strongly in ecosystem service policy. And that's just the way that things have developed. So ecosystem services that are linked to more measurable change or product are more amenable to policy acceptability. So things like water quality, changes in water quality is something we can measure. Carbon storage is something we can measure. Habitat creation and landscape protection is something that can be measured and can be potentially assigned a value. And species presence or species diversity is something else that can be measured and potentially, while maybe not easily, but can be assigned some sort of value. So those are the things that we see showing up in ecosystem service policy, are these types of ecosystem services. With respect to policy types, I just want to talk very, very briefly about regulatory policy. Looking so regulatory policy are specific regulations that have some sort of legal implications. So a regulatory policy is put in place that prohibits a certain activity or prohibits a certain outcome. And if the landowner or the farmer makes decisions that that go against that prohibition, they may be subject to some sort of legal punishment or legal process. And so that's usually what we consider a regulatory policy. So something like an emission regulation would be a regulatory policy. In a lot of the literature in agricultural systems, regulatory approaches are often viewed to be unrealistic just because they are so very difficult to enforce over a large number of farms with very distinct economic, biophysical, and location characteristics. And so the regulation is only as strong as the enforcement, and if enforcement is prohibitively expensive, then the regulation really doesn't work. And so regulatory approaches are often not recommended in agricultural systems. However, there are certainly cases where regulation may be appropriate, and certainly where we're seeing some regulatory policies is where we have things like an irreversible loss, so extinction of a species. The Species at Risk Act has some components that are regulatory in nature. Native grassland loss, which may be an irreversible change, may be an approach that, or maybe an objective that could be met with a regulatory approach. Or those situations where an environmental change has a very, very high cost of mitigation. So things like water contamination, where a regulatory approach may be appropriate because of the fact that if you do get a water contamination, the costs of addressing that are so very, very high. So in certain situations, there may be a role for regulatory approaches, but I'm not going to talk about it any more than that. That's all we need to talk right now about regulatory approaches. Where we have ecosystem services that are highly valued by society, but provide little or no direct benefits to farmers and land managers, the type of policy approach we tend to see is introducing mostly monetary incentives, where farmers are encouraged to invest in different management practices that will provide greater levels of these ecosystem services. where there are clearly identified benefits to society, there is a role for policy measures that create incentives to stimulate greater supply. And so these are these payment program type policies, which are very, very common across developing countries to look at ways to change agriculture management that provide greater levels of environmental benefits. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about these payment type programs. And specifically, I'm going to spend a little time talking about what we have in Canada. And in Canada, we have, each province has a suite of BMPs, or beneficial management practices, under the Growing Forward program, which is the current federal provincial agriculture policy framework, which I believe comes, they go in 5-year cycles, and so the current Growing Forward program will come to an end in 2018. So I know the federal government is working right now to come up with the next version of Growing Forward. But the cost share BMPs are policy instruments that address ecosystem service provision and are represented by specific cost share BMP policy measures. So management practices that are been identified as being provide greater levels of environmental benefits or decrease environmental costs have been identified under these BMPs. And farmers are eligible for payments to assist them in adopting these management practices. When you look through the suite of BMPs, those that directly deal with ecosystem services but that are provided by prairie grassland systems are a very, very small subset of the BMPs. They don't, a lot of the BMPs don't deal directly with prairie grassland systems. They're much more focused on crop production systems. So I apologize, there's a lot of information on this slide, but just looking at the Canada-Saskatchewan Farm Stewardship Program, so Saskatchewan's version of this, I've identified, going through, identified 4 that maybe have a relevance to what we're talking about today. These would be riparian area grazing management and fencing BMP, which would be providing some monetary incentive, some cost share to farmers to fence off riparian areas to maintain the health of those systems. By the way, the little numbers in the parentheses at the end of each of these represents how much of the cost share the government will support, and the number at the end, the $10,000, for example, on riparian area grazing management, would be the upper limit of the amount of money that the government would be willing to provide for a single producer. So riparian area grazing management and fencing BMP, native plant establishment BMP, focused on establishing native grass mixtures, creek and stream crossing BMP, and the native rangeland grazing management BMP. So these are, I mean, some of the other ones you might be able to sort of suggest that they have some implications for grassland systems, but these are the 4 that seem to have the largest relationship. And these 4, if you look at them, you could identify there's an aspect of ecosystem services that are being focused on with these BMP policies. And so this is the policy tool that's primarily being used in Canada, Western Canada for sure, to encourage the provision of ecosystem services from these agricultural systems. Just to sort of as a comparison, I looked at the Alberta site and I haven't been able to interpret how they're delivering their BMP policies. And so I haven't included Alberta's system here, but looking at Manitoba, we get a slightly different view of the way that the Manitoba government is working with these BMP policies. They actually have a section of policies that they call ecological goods and services, which are BMPs to conserve and enhance ecological goods and services with a fairly strong focus on water quality. And their BMPs are administered through their local conservation districts. And so, again, I sort of went through and picked out ones that may have relevance for grassland systems. So water retention structures, wetland restoration, riparian area enhancement, similar to the one we talked about for Saskatchewan, natural area maintenance and enhancement, and perennial cover for sensitive land. So again, these are cost share BMPs that, if you look at them, there's a focus on providing some level of ecosystem services from these landscapes. So given those cost share type approaches, the payment measures provide some level of financial assistance to land managers who are willing to adopt those management practices. And these management practices have been, through a scientific process, identified as being capable of providing ecosystem services. This is sort of a repeat of what we talked about before, but there's two components of these ecosystem service values that are needed to support the delivery of these. What the farmers or landowners would be willing to accept to supply those ecosystem services. So if your payments are lower than what the farmer or landowner would be willing to accept, you have zero adoption. And so understanding the level of payment required by the farmer or the landowner is really, really important to figure out what's the appropriate payment mechanism. So it helps you to decide whether your payment level is too low. It also helps decide whether your payment level is too high. And that's important from a public policy perspective, is to try and get that payment level just right. We also need to know what consumers or society would be willing to pay for ecosystem services. So ecosystem services that are highly valued by society should likely be a strong focus of ecosystem service policy, and those ecosystem services that are less valued by society maybe don't receive as much attention and maybe don't get as high payments. So those are two aspects, two pieces of information that there's ongoing research, but it's nowhere near there in terms of helping us have a complete understanding to support the development of these policies. We also know that that the level of payment required to pay a landowner or farmer to adopt these BMPs is in the context of what else is going on in that landscape. And so understanding what we call in economics the opportunity cost. So what's the value of that land in its next greatest use will have a big impact on how much needs to be paid to farmers in order for them to adopt these BMPs. And this opportunity cost will be influenced by a number of things, from commodity prices, options for alternative land use, a whole bunch of different things that will have a big impact on whether the farmer would be willing to adopt that BMP or not. And I just found that it was an interesting article that was published in Science, which looked at, this is one of those things that's happening on the landscape, is oil and gas development and its impact on ecosystem services. These figures show the amount of biomass per year that is removed due to oil and gas development. This is for the central plains of North America, so Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and then the central US. And we can see that from 2000 to 2012, there's been a significant removal of biomass from rangelands due to the oil and gas development, as well as large land areas that have been used for oil and gas development. So if you're a farmer or a landowner who has land that has potential for oil and gas development, that becomes a significant part of your opportunity cost. Do you want to adopt a BMP or a management practice that may preclude you from taking advantage of opportunities with respect to oil and gas development? So this isn't the whole picture, but I think it's worthwhile thinking about in terms of understanding the levels of payments that are required. So those are the payment approaches to policy, which as I identified earlier, are probably the primary mechanism. The other important area of policy that Canada actually uses quite a bit is what we call information policy. And so where there's ecosystem services that are linked to direct benefits to the farm, so as we talked about earlier, those ecosystem services that the farmer perceives as providing a direct benefit to them, those are going to be supplied by land managers. And so productive pasture systems are a direct benefit to landowners, and so at some level landowners are going to provide those benefits without a policy incentive. And so in many cases, limited or no policy intervention is appropriate with respect to providing some of those. There may be a need for involvement in certain areas, such as providing information to support adoption of different types of management practices. So going back to my discussion of the Saskatchewan BMP policies, one of those was a pasture management approach. And so that may be something that, that encourages producers to adopt management that provides greater levels of ecosystem services from their land, beyond what they would provided without that information or that management plan. There may also be a role for providing specific technical assistance to support the adoption of appropriate management. So again, the farmer is going to do it anyway, but maybe some technical assistance might provide an additional incentive to provide those ecosystem services. So information policy can provide may have a very good role in, particularly in grassland ecosystem services. There may be a real role for information policies. Where we have ecosystem services that can be provided as joint products, so it's a we have we can't necessarily separate ecosystem services. There's multiple outcomes from a particular management practice with respect to ecosystem services. So understanding these joint ecosystem services and putting in place policies to provide multiple ecosystem services may be a way to have policy that has lower cost. And so this is another area where we're short on information, is understanding that functional relationship between providing these various co-benefits. So carbon sequestration can be provided, and a co-benefit of that may be water filtration and higher forage production. So understanding the relationship between those co-benefits may assist in the development of appropriate policy. I just wanted to to tie into that last bit of discussion, talk a little bit about one approach that can be used to help understand the relationships between the provision of ecosystem services and provision of different types of ecosystem services, including the provisioning ecosystem service as well as the others. And so that's to develop some sort of specific analysis of the trade-offs between socially valued ecosystem services and commodity production. So as we talked about earlier. And what these trade-off approaches allow us, it allows us to illustrate what is given up or gained without requiring a specific economic valuation. So we can look at a landowner who adopts, who provides a certain level of ecosystem service, maybe a provisioning service at a particular level. What are they giving up in terms of a cultural ecosystem service, for example? So understanding that trade-off. We know that resources will be allocated to that use that provides the greatest value, and the value of some parameters are not well represented. So a trade-off analysis allows us to look at things where we may not have values, and quantifying those values may be a very difficult process. So here's a little curve from a paper published by Arisman and others in 2016, and it shows again farming intensity on the x-axis. We have at lower levels of farming intensity, there's higher levels of biodiversity. As we increase farming intensity in this situation, we get lower levels of biodiversity, and these red dots represent the actual site-specific data with respect to farming intensity and biodiversity. So this red curve really represents a bit of a trade-off curve. So at higher levels of farming intensity, what you're giving up is levels of biodiversity, and so coming up with some sort of policy mechanism can help us understand where we should be along this curve if we're interested in both biodiversity provision and commodity production. And so that trade-off function allows us to interpret that in a way that, that is sometimes useful from a policy perspective. This is a figure that came out of a paper from Knopf in 1996, and I think it's a really useful illustration of this, to some extent, this trade-off function. It looks at grazing pressure and then looks at where certain bird species are located under different levels of grazing pressure. And so what this figure shows is that at different levels of grazing pressure, you get different types of species, different types of bird species showing up. And so again, it shows a bit of a trade-off. And so if you have excessive grazing pressure or heavy grazing pressure, you know there's certain numbers of species that you're going to lose from that system. But it has benefits to other types of species. And so understanding the value or the role of these various species in the system helps us understand from a policy perspective what level of grazing pressure should we encourage on different landscapes. And so again, a piece of information that helps understand from a policy perspective. I just want to cover this very quickly. This is some work I did with Karen Hickman from Oklahoma State University a few years back, and this is really back of the envelope stuff, but I thought it was useful for this talk, where we did a bit of a trade-off analysis looking at economic returns from livestock production and plant diversity in pastures. And so we looked at a trade-off curve between stocking rate and plant diversity, and the stocking rate for 3 sites. One is in Wyoming, one is in Colorado, one is in Kansas. And we found that doing this trade-off analysis, stocking rate has limited influence on plant diversity, although higher stocking rates actually increase plant diversity at the Kansas site. And again, I have to emphasize, these are experimental sites, and so they may not represent true commercial sites, but it does provide us with a bit of insight. And the second trade-off analysis, which is probably the one that's more interesting from the perspective of this talk, is stocking rate and economic returns trade-off. So again, the 3 sites, we found that higher stocking rates increase seasonal weight gain. So higher stocking rates provide greater levels of provisioning services in terms of cattle production. This relationship was more limited in Kansas. And importantly, economic gains were much more variable at higher stocking rates. So there's greater economic risk associated with higher stocking rates in this situation. And so here's the curves. We won't go into them very carefully. Again, small data set. I don't want to go too far with it, but it gives you sort of a bit of an insight where the x-axis is plant diversity and the y is seasonal gain. So looking at the relationship between those 2 factors. And so from this analysis, we sort of came up with some insight where there seemed to be limited trade-off between economic returns and plant diversity. And so in that case, managing these pastures for economic returns, higher stocking rates, has little to no impact on pasture plants diversity. Or alternatively, managing the pastures for plant diversity will not have a significant impact on economic returns, which is an important feature. Managing these pastures for higher plant diversity could be an appropriate goal in that it doesn't have a large impact on economic returns. I think the most important insight that came from this is that there's greater economic and ecological risk imposed by choosing management that provides greater economic returns. So higher stocking rates results in greater economic and production risk in these systems. And so in this case, policy response may be to focus on decreasing the riskiness of these systems or giving information to producers that there's greater risk with having higher stocking rates. So again, this is not much more than back of the envelope, but it's an interesting insight from looking at these systems. So in conclusion, I think the ecosystem service concept can enable agro-environmental policy development that addresses landowner and societal well-being. I think it's a reasonable framework to approach agricultural systems and to address issues around human well-being and societal well-being, and as well as ensuring that agricultural production systems are still agricultural production systems. That's an important role for agriculture, is the production of commodities. And the development of effective policy measures is dependent on a more complete understanding of a number of different relationships. So that ecological production function I talked about. So by providing certain ecosystem services, what are we giving up in terms of other ecosystem services? What are the co-benefits associated with different types of ecosystem provision? What are the trade-off relationships between provisioning services and the other categories of ecosystem services? What are we giving up if we're providing more provisioning services? Importantly, a better understanding of the valuation of ecosystem services to consumers, society, as well as, and importantly, to landowners and farmers. And what are the payment levels required to provide ecosystem services across agroecosystems? So these are information needs that we have. At some levels we have some of the information, and some levels we have limited information. So that brings an end to the talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Belcher, for the fascinating presentation. If any of our listeners have any questions, please feel free to type it into the question section of the dashboard. There is one question here.
Yep.
What are your thoughts about the federal community pasture transition?
I think I think the federal community pasture system is an important represents an important aspect of ecosystem services coming from agricultural landscapes. Those, as my experience with them now, I've been to some, but I haven't been to all of them. But my experience with them is that there's a high level of biodiversity on these landscapes. There's a lot of socially beneficial ecosystem services flowing from them. And so I mean, from my perspective, I think looking at it from the context of ecosystem services, I think there's certainly an argument that can be made to put in place some sort of governance mechanisms or some sort of management approach that will ensure that there's benefits flowing to users of the pasture systems, the livestock producers, as well as ensuring that there still is those flows of publicly valuable ecosystem services coming from them. But what that governance structure looks like, I really have troubles formulating it. But I think the ecosystem service framework allows us to make an argument for the types of management that these pasture systems should be maintained under.
Thank you. There is a question here from a listener named Laura. In direct payment approaches, such as the example you gave with cost-sharing BMPs in Saskatchewan, is there an assurance methodology? That is, how are you able to assess whether the cost-sharing approach is delivering real, quantifiable benefits?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's an area that policy people spend a lot of time talking about. The BMP approach is very much a practice-based approach, and so the adopting landowners are compensated for adopting the management practice, and the payment flows through when that management practice has been adopted. So the presence of that management practice exists on the land. It doesn't have a capacity to determine whether the benefits from that practice are flowing. And so for example, fencing off a riparian zone, the payments flow when the riparian zone is fenced off, but whether that fencing of that riparian zone is providing those downstream benefits is not measured. And so that's a real struggle for policy, is to come up with a mechanism or develop an approach which looks at those outcomes rather than just the adoption. So it's a really good question. I mean, there's lots of work in figuring out ways to do that, but I don't think we're close yet to coming up with those specific types of policy approaches.
Great, thank you for that answer. If any of our listeners have any questions, please feel free to type it into the question section of the dashboard. I would just like to take a minute to note that anyone interested in other events going on for Prairie's Got the Goods Week, please check out the PCAP website. That's www.pcap.sk.org. and click on Events and Ecological Goods and Services Week 2017. Also check out YouTube, the PCAP channel on YouTube for recording of this video, and that way you can pass on the link to anyone who's not able to make it today. And it doesn't look like we have any more questions, so with that I would like to thank you very much, Dr. Belcher, for the great presentation. I know I learned a lot, and I really appreciate all the hard work that you've put into this research and into the presentation. So thank you very much, Dr. Belcher. I'd also like to thank all of the listeners today for tuning in. When you exit out of this webinar, you'll receive a questionnaire. It'll just take 1 minute to complete, and if you don't mind taking that minute, we would really appreciate it. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Caitlin.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Bye now.